couple of sort of random remarks before we start. So the trilogy, the Oresteia, moves from the investment in revenge by those who have suffered to the neutrality of the law court, where the characteristic of the jurors is their ignorance of what has been suffered. So they have no pathos. They don't actually, they haven't lived through what the crime is. Now, since, according to the chorus of the Agamemnon, pathemathos, we learn through suffering, the jury in the Eumenides can't possibly know enough really to judge. And therefore, you know going in, if learning through suffering is the formula for human beings, you know going in that the legal system that gets established at the end of the third play must be essentially flawed. So if that's true, why don't they despair? Why don't they turn into the chorus of the Agamemnon when they hear Agamemnon being killed and run off in all directions at once? Somehow it's necessary for the jury to be taught why they have to judge, despite the fact that they don't have the knowledge necessary to judge. So ideally, they would undergo suffering and be detached simultaneously. Perfect justice would require that. It's hard to figure out what that means, but that's what perfect justice would require. Interesting, by the way, that I'm not going to give you the details, but if you just look at the dramatic situation on the first page of Plato's Republic, that's the situation. You need simultaneous detachment and investment in order for justice to be possible. But it turns out that it's not possible, but it's sort of possible, and its sort of possibility is poetry, where you are an observer on the one hand, and you're participating, but you're not participating. So it means being in the movie and being scared, but not running out of the theater. The next best would be somehow to learn about the impossibility of perfect detachment in a detached way. That's tragedy. Tragedy is, in this sense, then, a necessary supplement to law. It makes us aware that law is imperfect on the one hand, and still absolutely necessary on the other hand. So question, real question, interesting question, is this why the great age of Athenian tragedy pretty much coincides completely with the great age of Athenian democracy? That's an interesting possibility. Okay, second random thought has to do with Clytemnestra as mother. The view of the mother, the parent who has literally suffered or labored and so is directly attached to the child, the view of the mother is that nothing is worth the death of the child. No child should have to die for an abstract notion of justice. And yet, Clytemnestra's demand for vengeance willy-nilly involves a demand for justice. So her attack on Agamemnon in the first play somehow reproduces what she takes to be the crime of Agamemnon. Or you could say, the defense of the familial, of the particular, of one's own, has to be made on the basis of principles. As soon as you see how strange the expression love of one's own is, or love of the particular. Love of one's own is the universal principle which is meant to describe why I prefer my sister. But as soon as that move is made to a principle, it's become something more than an attachment to one's own. So there's a wonderful Platonic dialogue called the Philebus, in which Socrates, it opens with Socrates summarizing a prior discussion that he's just had with a man named Philebus about which is better, the life of wisdom, and he lists a whole bunch of things that go with it, or the life of pleasure. And he lists a whole bunch of things that go with that. And then, so he sets it up for a new argument. It turns out that Philebus is no longer the one arguing with him, but it's Philebus's disciple named Protarchus. You listen to them and they battle back and forth. It's sort of typical Platonic dialogue. And then at a certain point, there is an indication that Philebus has just fallen asleep. He's not listening to this conversation anymore. And that, of course, forces you to ask the question, how come? Well, he doesn't care who wins the argument. If you really believe that pleasure is more important than wisdom, you're not invested in who wins the argument, which is more true than the other. That's a question of wisdom. That's not a question of pleasure. So his disciple is fighting tooth and nail for the view that pleasure is superior to wisdom, but he means pleasure with a capital P. Pleasure as something that we're identifying as the principle of the good life. But in fact, Philebus likes pleasures. He likes, all sorts of things. So it turns out that the preference for pleasure with a capital P over wisdom is really a concealed form of the preference for a kind of wisdom. You want to know that this is the way to live your life. Whereas if you're Philebus, that bores you, you just fall asleep. Plato's wonderful in that way because he makes it's done with such a light touch. If you're not looking very carefully, you don't even notice that Philebus has fallen asleep. Something like that is the problem of, you could say, and Aeschylus is very much aware of the fact that he's doing this. You have the principle love of one's own versus love of a universal principle, an attachment to the particular, the female versus the male. And it turns out that as soon as you announce the female as a principle, you violated the principle that you think you're articulating. Aeschylus knows that because he identifies Clytemnestra as a manly woman in the first reference we have to her in line 10 or 11, whatever it is. So the difficulty is there's something very important that has to be articulated, and as soon as you articulate it, you lose it. Because what it's supposed to be opposed to is, and that's, of course, connected to this principle, pathe mathos. You learn by suffering. Pathos, you could say, is nothing. There's the perception of this or the perception of that, but as soon as you call it pathos, you've generalized it, you've articulated it as a principle, and you've lost what it is supposed to be that you're aiming at. It's why the Oresteia moves toward Athena, and you anticipated me. The goddess who's born only of a father, who says at Eumenides 864 on your page 262, this: let there be foreign war, which will come easily enough. In it shall there be, I won't worry about the translation right now, mighty passion for renown. And the interesting thing is that Athena is taking this to be the consequence of settling the issue of Orestes' trial. But of course, it makes you realize that she's just advocating what Agamemnon did at the prior to the beginning of the Agamemnon. So she's making possible the prosecution of a foreign war, which is what started this whole mess in the first place. Plus, of course, she also says that she always sides with the male. So let's start over. why is matricide linked up with the battle between the Olympian gods and the pre-Olympian chthonic gods, the gods that go back to the earth? In other words, what does it mean for Zeus to take over? So you could say that Zeus stops the potentially endless generational wars. Ouranos gives way to Kronos, who castrates him, who gives way to Zeus, and presumably Zeus would just give way to another god. Zeus stops this by literally swallowing the mother, Metis, whose name means mind, and giving birth to the child himself. So Athena is somehow meant to be the model for the solution. We don't know, we know what the elements of the solution have to be. We don't quite understand how they fit together yet, but we know enough to know that she's supposed to be the model. And it's not an accident that if we go back to the libation bearers and we remember what the etymology given there for Dike was, it was Dios Kore, which is daughter of Zeus. So justice is being linked with daughter of Zeus, and of course, that's who Athena is. But swallowing the mother proves not to mean doing away with the mother, but literally incorporating the mother. So the Oresteia, in some way, traces the masculinizing of the family in the sense of its presentation as a principle. Start over. The Furies of the Eumenides are no longer simply Orestes' Furies. They're Furies in general. Notice, by the way, that although they defend the mother, they themselves are traced to a pre-earth origin. The mother of all mothers is not their mother. They are children of the night. So as Orestes' Furies, with a small f, they mean something like guilt. They're particular, they're individual. But once they're externalized, beginning of the Eumenides, and given a being apart from Orestes, they necessarily stand for something more general. And that seems to mean that between the libation bearers and the Eumenides, Orestes goes sane. Everything that was his madness now gets put on stage. Remember that quotation I read you last time from Book 4 of the Aeneid. Or put it somewhat differently, the Furies as reactive, anger, are necessarily dependent on some specific prior crime. We get angry at something particular. The Eumenides, which means something like good anger, which is somehow positive and exists in its own right. How is that possible? So if anger is fundamentally reactive, we are angry at, it looks as though what begins to happen when the Furies are pulled out of Orestes and put on stage at the beginning of the Eumenides is the experiment is to see whether you can take these inner Furies, objectify them, and take the reactive character out of them, make them somehow positive and existing in their own right. The last play is about this transformation. Anger is going to be civilized, not simply done away with. That's what it means to incorporate it. It's not simply gone. It's not as though we're meant to think that justice is possible without anger, but as long as anger is allowed to be reactive in the way it ordinarily is, it will never be altogether just. So the problem is, in a way, the problem of righteous indignation. Is it possible for indignation genuinely to be righteous? Now, this is connected, or proves to be connected, to the rule of law. You put it in this way. You can do right things in two ways. So you do something because of the particular content involved in your action. Or you do it not because of the particular content, but because it's right. But it's hard to know what then motivates you, but if the rightness is something that's indicated by the fact that it's lawful, you could say law always has two things. Points to two things. On the one hand, the law is either an advocating or a prescribing of something. Don't kill, in which case you might not kill because you find murder abhorrent, or you might not kill because it's the law. Your motive might be to obey the law, to use a famous expression of an 18th century German philosopher. So act so that the maxim of your action will, through your willing it, become a universal law for all mankind. That's Kant's formula for moral activity, the categorical imperative. You act in such a way because it's lawful, not because of the particular situation. But obviously you can't do that unless there's a law. So it turns out the connection between pulling the Furies out, giving them a kind of positive stature on the one hand, and legality has something to do with providing a motive that isn't particular on the one hand, but is particular in a way on the other hand. So the connection between law-abidingness and the externalizing of the Furies, that's not an accident. Only when there's a law does it become possible to do what is right for the sake of the law and not simply for the particular end. So the Eumenides moves from fury as something you feel to fury, an externalized being, to law. So we'll start over last time, okay? We think of something like, oh, hell, as a dilution of real hell, as a mild reference to eternal damnation. The Oresteia, in a way, reverses this order. Originally, there's fury, little f, feeling. And then there's fury, capital F, one of these people, one of these hags on stage. And then, interestingly, fury, little f, gets interpreted in terms of furies. That's somehow the significance of the ritual mourning at the beginning of the libation bearers. Now, we're at the last stage where we interpret our fundamental experiences in terms of poetic projections, which were themselves interpretations of these passions. So there's a wonderful remark by Oscar Wilde, who, I don't know, I wish I could quote it because I'm sure that it's said much more elegantly than I will, but Wilde remarks that there was no London fog, no fog in London at all before Impressionism. It's interesting to think about what he means by that before the artistic movement of Impressionism. Now, tragedy always takes a metaphorical understanding, which we have come to take for granted, and forces it back to its original meaning so as to make us re-experience its strangeness. And so re-experience the difference between it and the experience it was meant to describe. So it's a little bit like, I probably have used this before, forgive me, but it's a little bit like shaking hands as a custom. You know where it originates? When you shake hands, it means that you are prevented from pulling your sword out, right? So it's an expression of goodwill that originally looks as though it's a movement that's meant, I won't fight you, right? I won't pull my weapon. This is why left-handed people are understood to be sinister, because it doesn't bother them. They can, shake hands and pull their weapons. So you don't trust left-handed people. Any of you, some of you are left-handed. Probably about 10% of you are left-handed. Of course you are. But in Greek, the word for left-handed means something like best. So ancient Greek, not in modern Greek too. Yeah. Right. So where am I now? Oh, drawing swords, right? So it turns out that we have certain rituals which over the years lose their meaning. You just, you're introduced, you shake hands. We don't do it as much anymore. In Germany, it used to be almost an obsession. I bet they don't do it as much anymore either. You shook hands with everybody. But over time, of course, the underlying meaning of it is lost. So what tragedy does is create a situation where these things that you do ritually and mechanically all of a sudden have meaning again. Euripides does that with the problem of human sacrifice in the Iphigenia among the Taurians. Okay, so tragedy is a sort of rebarbarizing of ourselves in thought. So the original meaning of fury is something like a human claim to absolute right. Now, the feeling that you're absolutely right is, in a way, the feeling that you have complete and divine support for what you say. That's what's meant to be captured by the externalizing of fury into furies, by turning them into goddesses. Or you could say, go to hell literally implies invoking furies and involves an assumption of godlike powers. That's why there's a biblical prohibition against it. At the same time, externalizing gods means acknowledging that we are not gods. Having deities outside, the actual writing of the metaphor, the creation of the metaphor, saps us, and also, by the way, the Furies in the Eumenides, saps us of the anger that gave rise to metaphor in the first place. The question then is this: how is it possible to preserve the anger, the fury, that gives the furies some meaning, while not giving up the salutary effect of generalizing that anger? So how are Eumenides possible? Or, put it in a slightly different way that you'll be familiar with, What does it mean that they lose the trial, the Furies get furious and threaten the Athenians with all sorts of ills, and then Athena finally convinces them to be to come to live in Athens, to come live beneath Athens. What does it mean that? How does she convince them, and what does it mean that she can put together? I mean, they don't stop simply being Furies. What would the point be if you simply turned them into docile pussycats on the one hand, and on the other hand, they can't be Furies and stay at what they were and stay in Athens. So what exactly are they? What is the compromise? What makes it possible for them to accept a home in Athens and become regular gods? And how can they do that without completely losing their character as Furies? That really is a version of the problem, is justice possible, that Aeschylus is forcing us to at the end of the trilogy. If justice meant doing the right thing, right, then if Apollo were to walk through that door and manifest himself perfectly as Apollo, and we all agreed that he was Apollo, then we would all have to just do it. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense not to just do what he said. So we would behave justly because we would all do the right thing, presuming that he knew what the right thing was, but he's a god after all, and we're not. The difficulty with that is that it would completely infantilize us forever. We would never make any decisions ourselves, because when you're in the presence of a manifest God who knows what you can't know because you're a mere mortal, you have to behave as though you're a perennial child and the parent is in the room, on the one hand. On the other hand, that's not a human existence, nor is it particularly just to simply do what you're told because you've been told to do it. Our notion of justice has something to do with the fact that we're voluntary agents and we do what we do because we choose to do it. And if we choose to do the right thing, that would be just. But if we simply do it, then that's equivalent to a kind of mechanism. It's almost as though you're in a world where you have to behave in a certain way. If you have to behave in a certain way, it's not clear that you're behaving justly, however good the consequences are of your behavior. So it looks as though we want to get Apollo out of the room. Just get rid of him completely, and that way we can all act freely and therefore behave justly. But the difficulty is that if there's nothing like Apollo, nothing outside of us that forms our understanding of the way we ought to behave, then it looks as though it's literally a free for all, in the sense that you simply do whatever you want to do. There's no possibility of justice in such a world. Justice doesn't make any sense. And so it looks as though you need Apollo in the room and out of the room at the same time.
That's the compromise, putting him under the earth.
But it's not just this compromise, of course, it's also the God whose name you can't say, the God who appears to you but doesn't appear to you. So it turns out that our relation to the divine, if we're to remain human, in some way requires that there be something like gods, but it requires that they also not be perfectly manifest, because if they're perfectly manifest, we're no longer human beings. So that tension between the necessity for something beyond us and preserving our sense of our own freedom, that's what's at issue here. And it looks as though the giving the Furies a home beneath Athens is meant to serve as an image of this problem. Okay?
Yes.
Okay, so what are we going to do today? Apollo tells him to get out. That's 179 through 197. Then they have an argument. That's 198 to 234. This is all in Delphi. Then the scene shifts to Athens. Orestes gives a speech to Athena. She's not there. Her image, her agalma, there's a wooden statue of her that he's, has his arms around. His first speech to Athena is 235 to 244. Then the chorus arrive and they see Orestes and they speak, 245 to 275. Then we get Orestes' second speech to the absent Athena. That's 276 to 298. And then we get the first stasimon, the first choral ode, which is ordinarily in this play referred to as the binding song. That's 299 to 396. So let's turn to Apollo's speech, 179 to 197. Go, he says, get out of here. Now, it's interesting because at line 6970, Apollo had said that the Furies would not be acceptable to gods, men, or beasts. Couldn't mix with either gods, men, or beasts. Unwelcome. And then a few lines later at 73, he specifies Olympians and human beings. No, literally men, andres, male men. Here he says something different. He says on page 220, is it really 220? Yeah, I think it is. He says on page 220, bottom of the page, I don't think I'll read it. He says, you belong in a barbarian culture. Interesting, because if that's true, of course, it means that some human beings accept them. And then he says, top of 221, you should go live with lions. That's at line 192 and 95. So apparently some beasts are appropriate for them to mix with. So really, when you get right down to it, it's only the gods, and specifically the Olympian gods, who are altogether opposed to the Furies. So why? Now, you get a hint if you put together line 181, where they are likened to a snake. For fear you get a winged, glistening snake. And then line 193, where they are likened to, where they're said, do you not hear, no, that's not what I want. The den of a blood-lapping lion should be the habitation of such creatures. You should live with lions. And then change your translation of 196, be off being goat-herded without a shepherd, so they are likened to goats. So in the space of 10 lines, he calls them snakes, goats, and says they belong in lions' dens. So you put those three together, snake, a lion, and a goat, and you get a chimera, a monster who is the daughter of Typhon and Echnida, Hesiod tells us. A monster, called a monster because what it means to be a monster in Greek poetry is a being without a principle of wholeness. This lack of wholeness is exactly what Apollo goes on to object to. His speech from 213 to 224 attacks their understanding of justice. So on 218, look on page 222. For the marriage bed granted by fate to man and woman is mightier than an oath. By justice, being guarded. They make the mistake, in other words, of taking the part of the mother, but not the part of the husband. So theirs is a partial understanding of justice with no sense of the whole. It's utterly reactive, and it reacts in certain situations to certain particular infractions, but doesn't think about the whole. Now, in the next section, the argument between the chorus and Apollo, where they argue, the chorus at line 200 say, all of the guilt, all of the responsibility is Apollo's. But in all things you have so acted that the blame is yours alone. The aitia is yours alone. The responsibility is yours alone. And so not Orestes. They prove then Apollo to be right in a way. They blame whomever they speak to wholly. It's in a way characteristic of anger when you think of it, the way in which it lashes out at its adversary being whoever happens to be present and represents this more general sense of what it's opposed to. And then on line 208, you get this. Bottom of 221. I'm going to change the translation. But this is ours being so ordered, they say. We have been fated. This is what we are. There's no choice on our part. Now, this is contrasted in the section, in the argument between them, to Apollo's emphasis on choice, and especially the choice involved in marriage. And his own parting remarks about what he cannot willingly do. I cannot willingly break an oath that I made to Orestes. So Apollo's thinking of them as a monster, his claim about partiality, seems to mean that for Apollo and for the Olympian gods generally, what is a matter of will is prior to and more important than what's a matter of necessity. If you think, you can get a sense of what's at stake if you think about the way in which the old gods so much more obviously represent powers, Uranos, Gaia, heaven, earth, chronos, time. There's a way in which they are persons. On the one hand, they do things, and on the other hand, what they do is pretty easily interpretable as natural forces doing not what they choose to do, but what they have to do. Whereas by the time you get to the Olympians, some of that is present, but it is not. It's not altogether present. That wonderful. I think I told you about the wonderful. This is in the Uffizi, I think, in Florence. The wonderful painting of Venus and Mars, having just slept together, and Mars's armor is all over the place, and the little putti are playing with it, and Venus is fully clad and has this wonderful smile on her face. I think, properly interpreted, the whole of Homer's Iliad is in some way present in that painting. So the new gods are more obviously anthropomorphic. They're more obviously concerned with their being as persons, and what goes along with that is their understanding of the importance of willful action rather than necessary action, and therefore the priority they place on marriage over and against kinship, blood kin. Then we get Orestes' first speech to Athena. line 235 through 44. So if you look on 223, you get this. Queen Athena, I have come at Loxias' bidding. Receive the avenger in a soft temper, preumenos, not as suppliant nor with unclean hands, but blunt, but punishment blunt and worn away. Punishment against other habitations and journeys of mortals, crossing over land and sea alike, and keeping the oracular commands of Loxias. I come to your house, your image, your agalma, goddess, will I guard here as I await the issue of the trial, the end of the trial, the purpose of the trial, the issue of justice, the purpose of justice, or the end of justice. So notice that Orestes will claim here and later to have been purified all over the place before he came to Athens. So he didn't go directly from Delos to, or from Delphi to Athens. Notice that he's praying to a statue. His purpose is telos dikes, the issue of his trial, the purpose of justice, the end of punishment. Then the chorus enter, 245 to 75. First things they say are this. I've got it somewhere. Okay, top of page 224. Just so, here is manifest evidence of the man. Follow the knowledge of the voiceless informer. Yes, like a hound after a wounded fawn. By the drop of blood do we track him down. My many labors, deadly to men, leave my breast panting, for I've ranged through every place on earth, and beyond the sea in wingless flight I have come pursuing not slower than a ship, and now he must be cowering somewhere here. The scent of mortal blood so familiar smiles on me. Look again, scan every spot, that the killer of his mother may not escape us in flight unpunished. Now, it's strange. On the one hand, they say they smell blood, follow the hints of a voiceless informer. That seems to be, they're referring to their noses, they're smelling, and fly without wings over land and over water without a ship. So these three things seem metaphorical. There's no real blood left, certainly no smell, and yet they also say they're huffing and puffing with man-killing, man-wearying work. So are we meant to take them as literally smelling and pursuing? The problem is that it's not clear what they mean on the real level, on the literal level. What's what Eliot called the objective correlative of smelling blood. Now, in the second part of their speech, they say they want to avoid a trial, presumably because a trial settles the matter, and their power depends on its not being settled. Blood spilled can never be atoned for. Now, again, blood given in return, which the image they use at 264 to 5, has to be metaphorical, since they never indicate any intent to kill him. On the contrary, they indicate that they're not going to kill him. They threaten him at line 273 with Hades and imply that he will never get over this, even after death. So it's absolutely important for them that there's no possible release for what he has done. So the experience of this threat in the present is meant to be the cause of present despair. Orestes is meant to feel the burden of these beings who tell him, we're never going to let up on you. That seems to be what it means that they won't kill him, 267 to 8, but will drag him living to Hades. So you put it in this way. The actual burning in hell isn't the issue. By itself, that would be painful and hot. But the issue is the internal torment of imagining external torture. Then you get Orestes' second speech. Bottom of 225. Schooled in misery, I know well many ways of purifying, and I know where speech is just and where silence, and so on. So in this account, he has simply become the puppet of Apollo, who told him to speak now. This is directly connected to the fact that the blood slumbers. Remember, the Furies were asleep at the beginning, and fades. So the stain, the miasma of matricide is being washed away because Orestes no longer acknowledges himself as an agent, and so no longer acknowledges himself as responsible, aitios, and so feels no guilt, aitia. He clearly takes the fact that others have not been harmed by associating with him as proof of his purity. So Orestes is clean. He knows he's clean. And therefore, most astonishing of all, it's not at all clear from anything he says in these two speeches that he even acknowledges the voices of the Furies. His speech, with the exception of the very last word, his speech responds to nothing in their speeches. The one word, tonda, of them at 298 suggests that's the only thing that suggests he's even aware that they're there. So their hold on him is slipping, and it's not clear that he needs anything more than an awareness that they have no hold on him in order to break their hold on him. Okay. The chorus now sing the first stasimon. This is a song which is designed to bind Orestes, which suggests that they know that they're losing him. Notice that there's no indication that it has any effect on him at all. So it starts with an introduction, 299 to 320. And then, and in that introduction, they make the point that Athena and Apollo can't save him, 299 to 306. It's our fate, it's our lot not to touch those who are pure, only those who are hiding guilt, 307 to 320. Then you get a series of strophic pairs, 5 of them. So the first strophe is an account of their birth, their mother, night. Then you get a refrain, an account of madness meant to bind him to them. Then the first antistrophe, an account of their fate, of their lot. And then the refrain repeated, madness again. Then the second strophic system, 347 to 366. First, the strophe, the Olympians have to keep their hands off of Orestes because of our lot. Then a refrain, this is our choice. And then the antistrophe, Zeus has chosen this. Then the refrain again, this is our choice. Third strophic system, the strophe, we destroy men's high illusions. Then a refrain, we trip those who think themselves most free. Then the antistrophe about the mindless ruin of men. And then the refrain again, we trip those who think themselves most free. Then the fourth strophic system, for the strophe about their choice, their fate, their lot. The antistrophe, everyone fears this. Now, if you look just quickly at what I've been rushing through so that I can finish it before the end of the day, look at page 228. 2 lines from the bottom, line 311. Lloyd-Jones translates, its office. And to tell how our company apportions lots among men. And then jump to 230, first line of the antistrophe. For this is the lot that fate with her piercing stroke has ordained. Then the second strophe on first line on page 231, at our birth, I say, the grant of this lot was ordained. Is that it? I think that may be it. Okay, so some general remarks first about the introduction. In the Oresteia, there are 17 mentions of the Furies, and of them, 6 of them are connected to song. It's curious, and we would like to know why. On line 299 through 306, we get this. Not Apollo, I say, or mighty Athena shall save you from going all neglected down to ruin, not knowing where in your mind joy can dwell, a bloodless shadow, food for daimons. Do you not deign to answer? Do you reject my words? You who have been fattened up for me and consecrated to me. So they threaten him with being totally forgotten without any joy in his mind. Athena and Apollo can't protect him from an attack on his mind. But the interesting thing is that it cuts both ways. They also have no recourse if Orestes doesn't hear them. Do you not deign to answer? Do you reject my words? You who have been fattened up for me and consecrated to me. So they need to get at him while he lives. So the problem in a way is this, shows up in 307 through 20. They want to say they leave the clean-handed alone, but woe to him who tries to hide his unclean deed. So they get him either by exposing him to others, by shaming him, or by exposing him to himself, by guilt. But Orestes told us on line 281 that he'd already admitted his crime. So how are they going to get at him? Now, if you look at the binding song proper, it's interesting, because the song itself is meant to be the punishment. To sing is identical to punishing for them. Now, this makes much more sense of the repetition of the refrains. This sort of endless repetition is very much akin to the experience that we have when we feel guilty about something. And you go over it and over it and over it. And not only that, but the way in which it tends to come back in exactly the same words. It has the feel of the kind of song that's an earworm that you can't get out of your mind. It's there. You wake up and it's there. That's what guilt is like. So it's crucial that Orestes should hear them. They have to be his inner voices. They have to be the song that he can't get out of his head in order for guilt to be the punishment. But guilt, of course, here takes the form of a constant threat of punishment. It's only because of the threat of punishment that you are constantly reminded that you are worthy of being punished. So it's all metaphorical. Decay is decaying on the level of genuine remorse. Now, one final thing. The effect of the movement from the first strophic system to the second strophic system is to juxtapose fate or one's lot on the one hand, which is the result of being born into a role, into a lot, with freedom as the root of the action of both the Furies and of Zeus and of criminals on the other hand. They are born to avenge, and it is their lot or fate to destroy, or destiny. And yet, they claim to have chosen to overthrow houses where war erupts within and kin get killed. The question is what this claim for the coincidence of freedom and necessity, which becomes explicit at line 385 in the last of the systems, what it means. It seems to have something to do with the very character of a binding song. Guilt, aitia, is a kind of cause, aitia. It moves us from within, but it moves us with the feeling of being fated or necessitated. What the Furies do not understand is how being made visible, external goddesses will affect this power. So you could put it this way. The Furies function by way of a curse of some sort. If you look at 234, it's interesting. But to speak ill of others or neighbors who are free of blame is far from justice, and right will stand apart from it. The chorus then say, "You shall learn all briefly, daughter of Zeus." And for we are the eternal children of night, and curses is our name in our home below the earth. So they feed off righteous indignation. Now, this seems to require that they be recreated for every instance of their being. They're born out of the fury of an individual person in an individual situation. What then would it mean for them to have a permanent existence? It's unclear, but one thing we can say, one interesting thing we can point to, look at page 222. On 222, line 210, we drive them from their homes, the killers of their mothers. And then on 225, we get this, line 269 to 71. And if any other mortal who has wronged a god or a stranger with impious action or his dear parents. So God and strangers are added, but parents seems to be the crux of it here. And then on 230, we get this. That I should hold fast, that after mortals to whom has come wanton murder of their own, so literally own-handed outrage, outrage against one's own. And then finally, on page 235, we get this. Line 421, the killers, and he's just mistranslated here because he doesn't like it. The killers of mortals we drive from their homes, not the killers of their kin, the killers of mortals. So the chorus moved from matricide to murder in general. They get pulled out and they get made progressively more universal. At the end, Athena will give them a new place, a new plot, a new lot of their own. What we're watching is that how difficult it is for them to hold on to what they understand to be their primary function once they've been pulled out and made goddesses in their own right and not somehow dependent upon the soul, the particular soul who's committed the outrage. Well, it looks as though Orestes is attempting to say, his Greek version of time heals all wounds, that gets less and less. So on the one hand, you could say they know that. And on the other hand, there's the binding song. The binding song exists because they know that, the tendency to just sort of forget that you did a bad thing. But the character of the binding song for them is meant to be a reflection on what happens when human beings feel guilty. I can't emphasize too much that it is in a way like a song that you can't get rid of in your head. That's one of the connections to song here. There's a difference between an experience that's prosaic and you sort of forget about it, and you ever noticed, they knew this, of course, but how can I say this without exposing, well, what the hell? So when I was very young, I did a lot of musical comedies. I still remember all those words, but I don't remember. Why should I remember them? Well, I remember them because they're attached to tunes. So it turns out to be very handy. For example, if you're getting an MRI and you have to keep your mind off the fact that this thing is like 2 inches from your head. So if you've memorized things, you can just sort of shut your eyes and go through what you've, go through what you have, but what's remarkable is that all of that was now, it's like it's over 50 years ago. And I still, but it's because of the song that you remember it. So the Furies are taking advantage of that. And that's what I meant by saying they're sort of inserting an earworm into Orestes. The natural course of events is that over time things fade, but certain things don't fade, and they fade less when they're connected to music, and that's what they're really pointing to. It's important that they keep a hold over his mind in a way that music, and by implication poetry, makes that much, much more possible. probably because, in fact, in order for the ghost of Clytemnestra to speak to him, he'd have to think that he was wrong. So, you know, it's funny. There's something, isn't that interesting? Because in a way, the fact that they are, let me put it in this way. I've been saying all along that the big difference between the libation bearers and the Eumenides is that the Furies get externalized, and that's certainly true. And Aeschylus means that. But what's interesting is that something like that has already happened, because of the fact that they are identified as the Furies, the fact that he's going mad, he's being pursued by beings that are not his mother, means that there is a cosmic order that judges. He's acknowledging that there is a cosmic order that judges what he did to be wrong. And that makes it possible to feel, it looks as though without guilt, you've just got your mother complaining that you killed her, but with the Furies, you've got the equivalent of a third force saying, you killed your mother. It seems to me that the existence of that independence from the mother makes it much harsher and harder for him to reject it. And you need to think about this in terms of how things like guilt affect you, and see that Aeschylus has thought very deeply about it, and he's sort of created something that points to the need for guilt to exist. It doesn't mean that you just miss your mother, right? You've already incorporated something like a condemnation of yourself into the experience, which means you're judging yourself, which means that there's something like a principle lurking, even if you're not acknowledging it. So the distinction between the particularity of vengeance and the universality of justice is nothing like as pure and straightforward as I've been presenting it. And I think he knows that. Aeschylus knows that. We should probably stop. So whatever I said, we'll do. It's our lot to do it. And we choose to do it.